The Mayflower at 400 plus by Caroline Bigelow, Massachusetts Daughters of the American Revolution State Historian. Beginning with Martin Luther when he nailed his 96 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral, Catholicism and Christianity changed over the course of the 16th century. The Puritans, who believed that the Church of England had not purged itself of the corruption of Catholicism when it split off, formed factions to worship God in their own way. They believed that the true church was democratic and should be arranged into small congregations without a large governing body. But in England at that time, it was illegal to have any church but the Church of England, and people who did not attend services were fined heavily. So many of the English Puritans sought refuge in Holland. The group of separatists who would eventually leave to settle in the New World was one such faction. This group, known as the Scrooby Separatists, was led by Richard Clifton and John Robinson. They first settled in Amsterdam in 1608, but left for Leiden a year later when they were granted permission to do so. Life in Leiden was difficult for the Scrooby Separatists. Some of the members were able to find work in skilled and semi-skilled trades, similar to those they had had in England, but most of the men and women worked at unskilled day labor. The congregation looked after itself, but only just. Most of its money came from a select few members who were independently wealthy. Holland was also a much more liberal society than they were used to in England, which ironically was both the reason they could live there and the reason that they did not want to. Worried that their children were growing up to be too Dutch and not able to return to England, they decided that they would go to the New World, a place they believed was free from the corruption of the false church. Deciding to leave the relative safety of Holland for unknown territory was difficult, and not everyone in their group wanted to go. Eventually, it was decided that they would secure a patent to settle in the northern part of Virginia, a part close to the Hudson River. They wanted to be close enough to the other colonies to seek help if they needed, but far enough away from them that they would not be influenced by their politics. Once the patent was granted, those that wanted to and were able to settle their accounts in England and Holland first left Holland and went to England to pick up additional members of the congregation and supplies for the new settlement. Because most of them were urbanites, these pilgrims hired people to go with them to help with farming, crafts, protection, and other jobs necessary for starting a new colony. Not everyone making the voyage was part of the Scrooby Separatists. The company that the pilgrims had a contract and charter through sent additional people with them who would help establish the new colony and report its progress back to the company. There were also adventurers who would provide protection and serve as guides and scouts. The pilgrims called themselves saints and everyone else traveling with them strangers. There were twice as many strangers as saints in the company, which would prove to be very important in the coming months. The Pilgrims hired two cargo ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell, to take them to the New World. The Speedwell brought the Pilgrims from Leiden to England, where the rest of the passengers and the Mayflower were waiting. The Mayflower and the Speedwell left England on August 6, 1620. Within a few days, there were leaks reported in the Speedwell, and both ships returned to England. The Speedwell was repaired, and both ships again left port. But once again, the Speedwell had leaks, and the ships again returned to England. It was decided that some of the passengers, crew, cargo, and supplies from the leaky Speedwell would be transferred onto the Mayflower, and it would sail alone across the Atlantic. Those passengers who were staying behind would stay in England and depart the following summer with a second voyage. On September 6, 1620, Old Style, the Mayflower left England, bound for the New World for the final time, 2 months later than intended. The Mayflower was co-owned by 4 men, including Christopher Jones, who served as master of the ship on its voyage to the New World. In addition to Master Jones, there were approximately 30 crewmen. The Mayflower was built sometime before its first recorded voyage in 1609. The last record of the Mayflower is in 1624, when the owners had her appraised. Her ultimate fate has been lost to history, though one tradition claims her timbers were used to construct a barn in Buckinghamshire. Mayflower was one of the most common names for ships in the 17th century, and another vessel of that same name brought colonists to Plymouth Colony in 1629. The first half of the voyage was smooth sailing. The quarters the Pilgrims occupied were meant for cargo and not people or animals, so they were quite dark and very cramped. The Pilgrims made the best of it. On fair weather days, they were allowed to go above deck so long as they did not interfere with the duties of the crew. One child was born aboard the ship, a boy named Oceanus Hopkins. It was during the second half of the voyage that the troubles began. A late-season storm cracked the mast, but the crew was able to stabilize it using supplies brought by the Pilgrims. During the fierce storm, passenger John Howland was thrown overboard, but he managed to grab a halyard, and he was pulled back aboard the ship to safety. Surprisingly, only one passenger and one member of the crew died during the voyage. The Pilgrims had a charter to build their settlement in the northernmost territory of the Virginia Company, near the mouth of the Hudson River. The settlement, if successful, would begin a new colony in a region to be called New England. The storm that had almost sunk the ship had sent it far north of the Hudson and toward a land that had only been infrequently visited by French and Spanish fishing trawlers. The coast was only vaguely mapped, and the interior was largely unknown to Europeans. After 2 months at sea and in largely unfamiliar waters, the crew of the Mayflower sighted land. They attempted to sail south, but rocky shoals and rough waters prevented it. Instead, they decided to anchor in what is now Provincetown, at the very tip of Cape Cod, so they could send scouting parties to shore. Because winter was nearing and supplies were running low, it was decided that Miles Standish would lead a party of men ashore in the shallop to search for food and water and a place to shelter until spring. The scouting party explored along the coastline for several weeks. It was during one of the explorations that Miles Standish and his scouting party first encountered the indigenous population. That local group initially fled, but when the scouting party began digging in and around an area that contained graves and buried stores of food, they fired arrows at the scouting party. Miles Standish and his men returned fire with their muskets, which caused the natives to disappear into the woods. The scouting party took the food and supplies they found and brought it back to the ship. Those Pilgrims made a vow to make reparations for the food they took if and when they met up with the rightful owners again. Because they had arrived in the New World much farther north than they were given permission to, the men aboard the Mayflower decided to sign a compact in order to keep law and order amongst themselves. It was the first charter written by and signed by individuals for a colony in the New World instead of by and for a company. John Carver was chosen as first governor. Eventually, the scouting parties came across an abandoned settlement in a semi-protected cove, and it was decided to move the Mayflower to this location for the winter. This settlement had been a thriving Wampanoag village called Patuxet until an illness brought by Europeans had wiped it out around 1616. The land was mostly cleared, and there was a spring nearby, as well as food caches buried and left behind when the Wampanoag who had survived the sickness left Patuxet. While the women and children stayed aboard the Mayflower, small parties of men would go ashore as weather and health allowed to search for food and begin building the settlement. That first winter was very hard for those aboard the Mayflower, both pilgrims and crew alike. There were not enough supplies, and the ship was not designed to be inhabited during the winter. Once the pilgrims had completed a communal building, they went to live in it to better take care of themselves away from the crew and the tight quarters on board the ship. With only a handful of people healthy enough to be up and about taking care of the sick and the dead, building living structures for each family would take until the spring. Half of the passengers died before the summer, with most of the deaths occurring in January and February, and some winter days saw multiple deaths. By mid-March, winter was starting to lose its hold over New England, and the Pilgrims had built living structures for many of the surviving families. On March 16th, Samoset entered the settlement and greeted the Pilgrims in English. The next day he returned, bringing Tisquantum, also known as Squanto, the lone survivor from Patuxet, with him. Tisquantum spoke English fluently, as he had previously been enslaved by both the Spanish and the English, and he offered to serve as translator when the local sachem, Massasoit, arrived to speak with them. On March 22nd, Massasoit, leader of the Wampanoag Nation, arrived in Plymouth. He and John Carver drew up and signed a treaty, one that would last for 40 years. This treaty was simple. If any did unjustly war against Massasoit, we would aid him. If any did war against us, Massasoit should aid us. To ratify the treaty, gifts were exchanged, and the Pilgrims paid restitution for the food stores belonging to the Wampanoag that they had scavenged the previous winter. On April 5th, 1621, the Mayflower and her remaining crew left to return to England. They would make it there safely in early June. She would never again return to the New World. With most of their settlement built by mid-April, the Pilgrims spent the spring clearing land and planting crops. Tisquantum stayed in Plymouth and introduced them to native food crops and sustainable farming techniques that used minimal land and water. Governor Carver died in April, and William Bradford was chosen to replace him. Bradford would serve as governor on and off until his death in 1657. In mid-autumn of 1621, the surviving Pilgrims held a 3-day feast to give thanks to God for seeing them through the first year in their new home. Massasoit and other Wampanoag celebrated with them. The menu included venison that the Wampanoag had brought, fish, corn, squash, beans, and turkey. In mid-November, the Fortune arrived and brought new settlers, including several people who should have come over on the Mayflower and the Speedwell the year before. 2 additional ships, the Anne and the Little James, came in July of 1623, bringing the last of what was known as the Old Comers. These Old Comers were given special status in Plymouth Colony and were given more land than those who came later. Plymouth Colony struggled during its first decade, but once its debt to its investors had been paid off, it thrived. Towns sprung up on and around Cape Cod, but Plymouth remained the capital of the colony until it was merged with Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1629. The following photographs, like many others in this presentation, were taken by either myself, Caroline Bigelow, or by professional photographer Patrice Hatcher. These are examples of a Wampanoag homestead in the Plymouth Patuxent Living History Museum, old name Plymouth Plantation. These are photographs taken from the old fort in Plymouth Patuxent, the Living History Museum. These photographs are taken at Plymouth Patuxent, the English settlement at the Living History Museum. These are more photographs taken at the English village at Plymouth Patuxent. The site features first-person living historians portraying the pilgrims at various years between 1621 and 1640. This slide also features living historians at Plymouth Patuxent. Plymouth Patuxent also has a breeding program for heritage breed animals. These are examples of the Wampanoag village at Plymouth Patuxent. All interpreters for the Wampanoag village must be of indigenous descent, many of whom are Wampanoag. They do not portray their ancestors, but rather portray themselves and give context and a modern interpretation of the lives of their ancestors. These are more images taken at the Wampanoag village at Plymouth Patuxent. Many historians and interpreters bring their own children to work. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. You can be found at Facebook, Caroline Bigelow, by email at bigelow.caroline@gmail.com, or on Instagram and Twitter at Muses Realm.